Okay, so welcome everybody to the Alki Suffrage Club. This is brought to us courtesy of our partner, the South Seattle Historical Society, Log House Museum. Maggie Kase is the curator. She previously worked as a museum consultant and teaching artist. She specialized in visitor services support, public programming, exhibits, and interpretation, most notably for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation Discovery Center. Before moving to Washington, Maggie worked at a combination of museums and cultural centers in the programming and curatorial departments, including the Mount Edith Wharton's Home and the Berkshire Cultural Resource Center. She holds bachelor's degrees in arts management and English literature from Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts, and a master's degree in museology, which is my new favorite word, from the University of Washington, probably next door to the iSchool would be my guess. So yep. I want to say thank you, Maggie. We are recording, and please take it away as I mute myself and turn off my screen.
Well, thank you so very much. I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to Washington Women and the Power of Voting. As Alan said, my name is Maggie Kase, and I'm the curator for the Southwest Seattle Historical Society, and I'm super excited to be joining you all today. Before we begin, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the fact that the Southwest Seattle Historical Society and our Log House Museum are located on the traditional land of the Duwamish people, past and present, and I'd like to honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish people who have stewarded it throughout the generations. Washington Women and the Power of Voting is made possible by the generous support of our partners, Luna Park Cafe, For Culture, and Home Street Bank, as well as our partnership with the Washington State Historical Society. And this program also wouldn't have been possible without the work of Bethany Green, whose passion for this exhibit really helped bring it to life. The Southwest Seattle Historical Society's mission is to promote local history through education, preservation, and advocacy. As some of you might be aware, the Historical Society offers a wide range of programs and educational opportunities that explore the history of the Duwamish Peninsula, and we can't offer programs like this one without your support. So thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate it. I'm going to start today by giving you all some background information on our inspiration for this exhibit and let you all know who the key players are. The first half of this presentation is going to focus on women's suffrage kind of at large in the US so that we can get a sense of what's happening in the entire country before we sort of hyper-localize to Alki. So keep this information at the back of your mind as you hear about the movement at scale. The 19th Amendment granted women the right to vote in the United States in 1920. However, what's often overlooked in this conversation is that multiple states granted suffrage to women before that date. Women's suffrage was granted in Washington in 1910, though the fight for suffrage in this state started all the way back in the 1870s. What a lot of people don't know is that the women of Alki were really major players in accomplishing this feat. The Alki Suffrage Club was one of the largest suffrage organizations in the entire state, but very little was known about them today. One of our major hopes of this exhibit was to rectify that, to kind of give credit where credit is due, and just really highlight the fact that changemakers and activists can come from anywhere and everywhere. At its height, the Alki Suffrage Club had over 200 members. And most of them fell into relatively the same demographic categories. They tended to be white, educated, upper middle class ladies who had few or no children, and the average ages of the members was 46. Although, of course, these women go far beyond their demographics as well. They were mothers and wives and divorcees and artists and business owners, teachers and musicians, churchgoers and mountain climbers. Everyone really had their own reason for being there. In the last decade leading up to women's suffrage passing in Washington, we had three really key leaders to follow: Catherine Smith, Emma Smith DeVoe, and May Arkwright Hutton. Catherine was the president of the Alki Suffrage Club, so as we proceed, we'll be mostly focusing on her story, though it intersects with the stories of these other prominent leaders as well. But before we get there, we're going to talk a little bit about what the suffrage movement looked like in the United States as a whole. So, starting with some of the basics, just so that we're all on the same page, I think that in our contemporary context, a lot of times feminism and suffrage get thrown together conceptually. And while it's true that the two movements are related, the nature of the way that they interacted with each other historically is actually kind of complicated. The word suffrage comes from the Latin term suffragium, which refers to the right or privilege to vote. The term suffrage commonly refers to social movements in the late 19th and early 20th centuries that actively sought to expand access to voting. We're talking specifically about women's suffrage today, but in this time period, suffrage movements were also active for people of color of any gender as well. Feminism, on the other hand, refers to a really wide range of social and political movements, as well as an ideological commitment to interrogate and define the equality of the sexes, and then make that definition a reality. Historically speaking, feminism has worked to bring to light the unjust nature of gender stereotypes. These stereotypes have been structured society in a way that privileges the cis male experience, but feminism illuminates and attempts to correct the pervasive injustices that have been generated and structured by patriarchal social conventions and relations. As an ideological and socio-political movement, feminism has really been defined by a series of 4 waves. Each of these waves have been characterized by unique objectives and strategies to remedy social, political, and economic injustices through advocacy for women's rights, among a wide range of other endeavors. The first wave of feminism actually does intersect with the women's suffrage movement, but they're ultimately different. The women that we're talking about today likely wouldn't refer to themselves as feminists, although today that's how many people classify their actions and ideals. Today, though, we're living in the fourth wave of the feminist movement, which began in 2012 and is really characterized by the empowerment of women, the use of the internet, and intersectionality. 2 of the greater tenets of this new wave are thinking about the effects that gender norms have on society and really focusing on marginalized women. So, although there are a lot of parallels between the women's suffrage movement and feminism, they're not necessarily interchangeable contexts or concepts, especially in the context of our contemporary understanding of feminism. The call for women's suffrage was a single, specific expression of feminist activity in the 19th and 20th centuries. Suffrage represented an issue around which many feminists and their allies rallied to assert the rights and equality of women. The feminist movement sought and continues to seek the equality of the sexes. Having said that, many early suffragists didn't necessarily believe that all women deserved the right to vote. In fact, there was a really highly elitist inclination within the suffrage movement. Many organizers sought to secure the right to vote for white, English-speaking women as immigration, especially into urban areas, increased. The argument was actually made by many suffrage leaders that the right to vote was not necessarily a manifestation of the equality of men and women, but it was rather used as a means to assert the so-called superiority of white Euro-Americans over other ethnic and cultural groups. So, due in part to the racist and elitist undertone that pervaded certain factions of the suffrage movement, many feminists during the period actually devoted their energy towards different other social causes like workers' rights and trade unionism in order to illustrate the basic common humanity between men and women. Many feminists, including Charlotte Perkins Gilman, author and activist famous for her works The Yellow Wallpaper and Women in Economics, specifically argued that suffrage alone wouldn't liberate women from the confines of a patriarchal order. Instead, a broader movement that encompassed workers' rights, voting rights, and other social conventions was really necessary to realize a feminist vision for progress. Gilman's approach, I think, kind of underscores a subtle but significant difference between the suffrage movement and the feminist movement. However, it's important to note that while some aspects of the feminist movement at this time were inclusive and worked more broadly than the suffrage movement, racism, xenophobia, and elitism really still persisted within its leaders, including Gilman, and the ideological underpinnings of feminism at large. We're dealing with the ramifications of those ideological underpinnings still today. Switching gears a little bit to talk about the path to suffrage in the US, a lot of times when we're taught history, we think of big moments as being like the final culminating factors in a story. The 19th Amendment is passed in 1920, we've reached the crescendo, the rest is epilogue. But in actuality, suffrage laws change all the time. As recently as 2013, the Supreme Court invalidated the very famous Voting Rights Act of 1965, which initially prohibited racial discrimination in voting and outlawed things like literacy tests as requirements to be able to vote, which ended up turning significantly more power over to the states to mandate their own voting laws. As recently as earlier this year, we were seeing news stories about across the country about Georgia's General Assembly making sweeping changes to their state's voting policies, in a move that many experts think will restrict voting access for thousands. Although it's possible that I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, skipping straight to 2021, women have been voting on this continent since time immemorial. Indigenous women have been voting, shaping policies, and fighting for women's rights for over 1,000 years in Native nations across the country. After settlers arrived in the US, women's suffrage debates began as early as 1648, when Margaret Brent, who's pictured on the right here, demanded a vote in Maryland's colonial assembly. And at that point, we were kind of off to the races. By the time 1920 rolled around and the 19th Amendment was ratified, there were only 8 states in the whole country that had no suffrage for women. Most had partial suffrage, which depended on class, race, citizenship status, marriage status, and a whole host of other societal factors. As kind of a quick aside here, one of the strangest and most concerning things I learned about women's suffrage and feminism throughout history while I was putting together this program actually regarded marriage status. In many parts of the country, Washington included, if a woman married an immigrant who had not yet been granted citizenship, the woman themselves lost their citizenship. And then they couldn't naturalize unless their husband had also naturalized. The act that made this a reality was actually passed in 1907 and was called the Expatriation Act, and it wasn't rectified until 1922 with the Married Women's Independent Nationality Act, otherwise known as the Cable Act. Women's rights were heavily, heavily influenced by their marriage status, including their right to vote. So our exhibit, the Alki Suffrage Club, Catherine Smith and Other Female Freaks Who Won the Vote, actually covers the 5 years leading up to women's suffrage passing in Washington legislature in 1910. Again, 10 years before the rest of the country passed the 19th Amendment. Washington granting women's suffrage was actually considered to be a turning point for the entire nation's women's suffrage movement by some historians. Before we had passed the suffrage bill, it had been 14 years since any state had granted women's suffrage, but after we passed the bill, multiple other states followed suit very quickly. The bill that passed in 1910 actually wasn't the first piece of legislation that addressed women's suffrage in Washington's history, though. In fact, the first vote for women's suffrage was proposed by Arthur Denny in 1853, way before Washington was even considered a state. Had that bill been approved, all white women over the age of 18 would have been allowed to vote. It didn't pass, and it's actually speculated that that's partially due to the fact that Native American women, as well as all women of color, were explicitly excluded from the bill, and many of the lawmakers who were voting on the bill were married to Native American women at the time. The suffrage movement didn't really kick off in earnest here, I would say, until about 1871, when Susan B. Anthony and Abigail Scott Duniway toured the Pacific Northwest. Susan B. Anthony, of course, is one of the most famous names in the women's suffrage and women's rights movements, and Abigail Scott Duniway was a women's rights activist from Oregon and was one of the most influential women for bringing suffrage to the Pacific Northwest at large. These two ended their tour of the Northwest in Olympia, where Susan B. Anthony became the very, very first woman to address the Washington legislature. The next day, a suffrage bill was introduced where it failed yet again. But having said that, the first time that women in Washington state actually won full voting rights was in 1883, so about a decade after that tour. The bill was ultimately struck down in 1887 by the Territorial Supreme Court. Another voting bill was passed a year later, but in 1888 was pretty immediately overturned. So the question arises, why the back and forth? One major factor to women's desire for suffrage was to use their votes to actually affect liquor legislation. And when they had the right to vote, they did just that. Prohibition, alcohol accessibility, and suffrage are really, really deeply intertwined parts of history, which is maybe a lecture for another day, but the power of the woman's vote caused the state's liquor lobby to push really, really hard to overturn women's suffrage, and for a time they succeeded in doing that. By the time 1910 rolled around, many states had some form of suffrage for women, and Washington was no exception. Following all of this back and forth in the 1880s, in 1890, women's voting rights were passed for measures related to school elections, but school elections only. This was actually a really, really common bill throughout the country because the idea was that home and children were in the women's sphere and that managing schooling really counted as part of that. Our exhibit, of course, follows three key leaders in Washington's movement: Emma DeVoe, May Arkwright Hutton, and Catherine Smith. Emma DeVoe and May Arkwright Hutton are really well known to many historians as part of the suffrage movement. Both women advocated for and lobbied for women's suffrage in other states on the West Coast after achieving suffrage in Washington. Smith, though, fell off historians' radars, even though she was the founder and president of the Alki Suffrage Club, which later became the Washington Suffrage League. The Alki Suffrage Club was one of the largest and most engaged suffrage organizations in the state in the year and a half leading up to suffrage passing in November of 1910. We're going to have a little change of pace now and take a look at a video created by the Historical Society to give all of you just a little bit of background on Catherine Smith, May Hutton, and Emma DeVoe. And I think I have to stop sharing my screen for a moment so that I can make sure that you can all hear sound. So I do apologize about that. There we go, that's better.
If you are a woman voting in Washington, you have a woman from Alki to thank. She led one of the largest suffrage clubs in Washington, campaigned nationally for suffrage, and was credited as one of the most influential women in the state's fight for the vote. Her name was Catherine Smith. Before moving to Seattle, Catherine lived in Colorado. In 1893, Colorado granted women the right to vote. These women used their new rights to pass legislation, including setting up separate courts for children. This made a deep impression on Catherine, who thought that women were a positive influence in politics. Catherine lost her right to vote when she and her family moved to Alki in 1904. In 1906, noted suffrage organizer Emma Smith DeVoe began campaigning in Washington. This reignited interest in suffrage, and in 1909, Catherine joined the cause. Catherine traveled to Olympia to meet with senators and convince them to add suffrage to the ballot. When one senator asked her if it was fair that the suffragists kept sending waves of women to talk to the senators, she responded, "Well, it's a little like politics, isn't it?" Catherine founded the Alki Suffrage Club in June 1909. This club would grow to have over 200 members, making it one of the largest clubs in the state. She also wrote a regular column in the Seattle Star advocating for suffrage. Although she had many supporters, Catherine was also a target for those who opposed suffrage. The fire and brimstone Reverend Matthews denounced her and other suffragists as female freaks. Catherine fired back in the newspapers, calling his remarks coarse, discourteous, and unpatriotic. She even warned him that his holier-than-other-men attitude may prove to be his undoing. In the fall of 1909, Catherine traveled to Hawaii to recover from an illness. Rather than spend the time relaxing, Catherine collected signatures from the women of the territory advocating for suffrage. She was also credited with convincing the mayor of Honolulu to support the cause. On November 8, 1910, the voters of Washington approved the suffrage amendment. When Votes for Women, Washington State's pro-suffrage magazine, ran an issue proclaiming victory, they put 3 important leaders on the front page. Catherine was front and center. One journalist wrote of Smith, "Someday, when women vote in Washington, and we have women governors, and women councilmen, and women chiefs of police, maybe we'll build a statue in Pioneer Square to Mrs. George A. Smith and other Seattle suffragists." Catherine never did get her statue, but she should be remembered, along with the countless other women who fought for suffrage in Washington. Thank you for watching. As a nonprofit, everything we do.
Catherine Smith and many of the other suffragists at this time used the still hunt approach to win women's suffrage. The emphasis wasn't on public rallies or on political power. Instead, the movement really focused to rebrand wives, mothers, and sisters. Their goal was to influence the men in their lives to vote for suffrage. It was a more subtle approach in some ways. They distributed literature, they made a cookbook, they put up posters everywhere. And in Washington, they also enlisted the help of the Washington State Grange and other labor unions. I'm going to read you all a quote now from the organization that Smith ran. This is the Alki Suffrage Club's appeal to voters. "What women do not want? We don't want to be men, nor to usurp men's place in the world. We don't want to enter politics, become politicians, nor hold political office. We don't want to deprive men of their rights, restrict their liberty, nor ruin their business. We don't want to overthrow the government, nor break up the home. What women do want? We are perfectly satisfied that we are women. We are proud of our sphere, and we believe we occupy a very important position in the scheme of creation. We love our homes, which in the aggregate make the government, and we ask for the ballot that we may preserve and protect those homes and the government. We ask that we be granted our inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, for which our forefathers fought and died. To secure those rights, they established this government, deriving its just powers from the consent of the governed." We actually have a little bit of information on some of the women who would have participated in club events, like writing this appeal, so I thought it'd be fun to share some of that background with you all. First off, we've got Lorena Smith, who's pictured on the left here. She was the first school teacher in Alpha Prairie, Washington. She actually once survived a shipwreck off the coast of Alaska. No one knew how to operate the lifeboats, so she took leadership and she organized the crew to row in unison and sail everyone to safety. Second, we've got Carrie Day Baker, who's on the right on this slide. She was a graduate of the New England Conservatory of Music and a co-founder of the Alki Congregational Church. A lot of the women that we see involved with this movement were already community leaders in some way, but not all of them. And last but not least, breaking away from this mold just a little bit, one of the most interesting characters in the club was actually named Jessie Elliott. Elliott was an artist who was known in Seattle for her painting. She traveled around the world on steamships, paying her way by painting for passengers. She was actually divorced twice, which was relatively unusual at the time, so she ended up telling people that she was a widow. Of course, not every woman at this time agreed with the ideology that Catherine Smith and the Suffrage Club laid out, especially about political office. Dozens and dozens of women held political offices in the states that had already granted full suffrage, and women in Washington state would, of course, hold political office after it was granted. However, the missive that we just talked about showcases a lot of what the still hunt approach had to offer. By soothing men, women were more able to convince them that their votes wouldn't upend the social order. Because of this, the still hunt method became kind of an all-consuming project, and suffragists employed every method they could to convince men to vote for it. This included their fashion choices. We're going to watch another short video detailing the fashion choices of the women who wanted suffrage.
What does your clothing say about you? Maybe you wear a t-shirt from your favorite sports team. Maybe you wear certain clothing as part of your religious practices. Well, if you were a Seattle woman fighting for your right to vote in the early 1900s, your clothes might have said a lot about your politics. Starting in the 1850s, American women's clothing began to be more restrictive and bulky. In response, the bloomer was invented as an alternative. This outfit consisted of loose, baggy trousers gathered at the heel under a skirt that reached the knees. Although the bloomer was not initially created for the cause of women's suffrage, it became linked to the movement because women's rights activist Amelia Bloomer promoted them. Prominent suffragists like Elizabeth Cady Stanton liked how the bloomer was much less constricting compared to regular women's dresses. Many people, but especially men, ridiculed the women who wore bloomers because they feared the breakdown of traditional gender roles. They linked women wearing clothes that looked like men's clothes to women acting like men. Women who wore bloomers in public were so heavily mocked that even Amelia Bloomer herself stopped wearing them because it was distracting people from their work to get women the vote. The lesson of the bloomers taught later suffragists that pushing for radical change could alienate potential supporters. When the fight for women's suffrage in Washington reignited in 1906, prominent suffragists, including Catherine Smith, Emma DeVoe, and May Arkwright Hutton, promoted a method called the still hunt. The still hunt focused on quietly convincing men to vote for women's suffrage. They insisted that women voting would not change gender roles, but would instead make women better wives and mothers. Suffragists faced a lot of prejudice and misconceptions. Anti-suffragists claimed that women who wanted to vote were bitter spinsters, immoral women, or women who wanted to act like men. In order to soothe these fears, Seattle suffragists were very careful about projecting a certain image. They had to be fashionable, but not dowdy, modest, and above all, feminine. This communicated the message that these women fit into polite feminine society. Catherine Smith, the leader of the Alki Suffrage Club, was a master at striking this balance and was often praised by the press for her fashionable outfits and hats. Suffragists used accessories such as buttons, sashes, pennants, and ribbons to communicate their support of suffrage. This type of visibility also communicated strength in numbers and showed a united front. Washington Magazine, Votes for Women, stated that buttons were a way for even the shyest supporter of suffrage to show their support. Mass production meant that by the early 1900s, suffrage memorabilia could be produced cheaply and in great numbers. Suffragists took advantage of this and used accessories to create a brand for the movement. Washington suffragists used yellow, white, and green as their colors. The green was a reference to Washington's nickname as the Evergreen State. Another suffrage symbol added the number of stars to a flag when a new state passed women's suffrage. A popular button from the time showed the phrase "Votes for Women" surrounded by 4 stars representing Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, and Idaho. Washington would become the 5th star when it passed women's suffrage in 1910. Washington suffragists, including Catherine Smith, organized a Women's Suffrage Day at the Seattle World's Fair in 1909. Suffragists decorated the grounds with green Votes for Women banners and handed out green suffrage ribbons and pins for supporters to wear. Washington women won the right to vote in November 1910. Although fashion was not the only tactic Seattle women used to win the vote, it was an important factor. Votes for Women magazine cited visibility of the movement as a key factor to the campaign's success in Washington. Some women probably resented the narrow range of accepted dress that they could wear in order to be taken seriously. Fashion, however, was also a uniquely feminine tactic that was cleverly used by suffragists to gain voting rights. Thank you.
So that was just a little bit about the still hunt movement. Something really fun is that actually in the physical exhibit that's at our Log House Museum, we have a replica of a dress that Catherine Smith would have been really, really likely to wear at the time. So it's kind of cool to be able to go see that and be like, oh yeah, this is what Catherine Smith would have worn. Having said all of this, though, like all movements, Washington's suffrage movement had its own set of barriers and challenges. Some of them were personal. There was a lot of discord between DeVoe and Hutton, which Smith often found herself in the middle of, and some were political. As I mentioned earlier, women's suffrage had very large and very organized opposers in the liquor industry. Others opposed women's suffrage from a more personal bent. Women were seen as too weak-minded, too emotional, too uneducated, too gentle. And of course, if this sounds familiar to you, it's because the same rhetoric is used today to disenfranchise women in politics. Emma DeVoe and May Arkwright Hutton did not like each other, yet they were two figureheads in a critical movement to gain women's suffrage. May was considered to be a boisterous personality. She really didn't fit into the standard model of what a lady should be in the early 20th century. May was accused of bribing senators and using, quote, vulgar language. She was a wealthy lady who didn't need to work, but that wasn't always her background. She came from working class. On the other side of the spectrum, you had Emma DeVoe. Emma was a paid political worker whose involvement in this movement depended on her ability to keep her job. She pressured suffrage clubs around the state to elect her as the president of the Washington Equal Suffrage Association. It guaranteed her job, but it really did not earn her any goodwill with the people she was working with, and it set May Hutton even farther against her. Where did Catherine Smith come into this conflict? Well, at first she sided with Emma DeVoe. She wrote Emma a really, truly horrified letter when she received word that Hutton had slandered her husband to a senator. Catherine was a really ladylike character, much more in keeping with what one would expect from a wealthy woman in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Emma and Catherine both utilized the still hunt method in swaying people to suffrage. Eventually, though, Catherine and May actually became allies against Emma. After taking over as the president of the Washington Equal Suffrage Association, Emma also started plagiarizing the Votes for Women magazine. She took out mentions of other suffrage clubs and passed it off as a WESA publication, something Catherine and May really heavily disagreed with, and they weren't alone. 20 other suffrage clubs refused to support Emma, and unfortunately, they were labeled as insurgents and ultimately kicked out of the Washington Equal Suffrage Association. During the election season, the conflict was set aside, but it did come back again in January 1911. WESA was in the process of rebranding as the National Council of Women Voters when Catherine unexpectedly showed up to the meeting. She asked to read a letter of grievances against Emma, but wasn't allowed and was actually kicked out of the meeting. Catherine and other leaders responded by writing to political leaders across the country denouncing Emma. Internal conflicts weren't the only barrier to this movement either. Catherine often took on her suffrage opponents personally. As we heard before, once while she was recovering from an illness in Hawaii, Catherine actually managed to convince the mayor of Honolulu to support suffrage. She also took on one of the most prominent opposers of suffrage in our state, a very fire and brimstone preacher named Reverend Matthews, who famously referred to suffragists as female freaks in the newspapers. Catherine didn't stand for this. She criticized the Reverend intensely and said that his holier-than-thou attitude would be his undoing. Following this response, Catherine actually earned herself a weekly column in the Seattle Star, where she presented arguments for suffrage every single week until the election. And of course, we do have a bit of a barrier to a celebration of full women's suffrage here, which is the simple inequity that existed in these bills. Famously, the 19th Amendment allowed women to vote, but in practice generally excluded women of color, typically along the lines of whether or not they were considered citizens. So Washington's bill allowed Black and white women to vote. But Asian American people only won the right to vote in 1943, and in practice not until 1965. And Native Americans weren't considered citizens until 1924. Many of these groups were denied the right to vote for decades, until even though they were legally allowed to. I will say as well, Black activists were organizing and fighting for the rights to vote alongside white activists, and yet many of their names are lost to history or separated out of these conversations. Suffragists and anti-suffragists alike often spoke the shared language of racism. These conversations about rights are often celebrated as separate milestones, but in fact, the work to rectify racial inequities and gender-based inequities are really highly tied together historically, and of course are still happening today. The win in Washington state really revitalized the movement for women's suffrage after 14 years without a victory. In the 2 years following Washington's vote, California, Arizona, Kansas, and Oregon passed bills that granted full women's suffrage. Hutton, DeVoe, and Smith ended up working in California and Oregon to help make this dream a reality. After passing the bill to grant women full voting rights, the movement didn't end there. Organizations that still exist today, like the League of Women Voters of Washington, were created to help navigate the complicated land of voting and civic citizenship. Today, the League deals with issues like the judicial system, election laws, government, state finances, children's services, and even the environment. Women's rights are human rights. While feminism and suffrage are not one and the same, they did share many of the same goals: to give women agency over their own lives as full people who were not defined by the patriarchy, whose thoughts about politics matter and should have impact in the way our legislature is run. Today, women voters can make or break candidates, have shaped laws around schools and alcohol, equality in the environment. Suffrage issues at large aren't over in the United States, and I encourage everyone who enjoyed this presentation today to take a more sustained look at who does and doesn't have the right to vote in the US today. So we've done a pretty deep dive as to what suffrage is and why and what the movement looked like in the United States, but what we haven't covered yet is the why. Voting rights mattered to activists so much that they spent decades organizing in order to win that right. Some women went so far as to move from state to state as suffrage laws were passed. And since we've reopened, I've heard many stories of women who would do bold things like throw themselves under horse and wagon carriages to get the attention of people who needed to pay attention in order to make this happen. Voting is, of course, important because it provides individuals with an opportunity to actively participate in a democracy. A democratic government is one structured by and for the people it governs, and so voting is the mechanism that endows individuals with power to shape their government and the policies enacted by it. Great emphasis is placed on the power of individual votes in presidential elections, and rightfully so, but the power of a vote extends beyond the presidential election. For instance, even if you vote in a state that is likely considered a sure thing for one or two major presidential candidates, there are other down-ballot contests and referendums, including elections for the state and House of Representatives, governorship, and local positions that all matter a lot. Each one of these elections shapes government and society at the local, state, and national level. Thus, voting makes an enormous difference as it helps to shape the future of society. Being denied the right to vote means being denied a chance to shape the government laws which affect your life and your rights. The women who formed the Alki Suffrage Club and others like them throughout the state and country recognize the power of the vote and the agency it provided them as individual agents of historical change. To the founders of the Alki Suffrage Club, the right to vote was an invaluable opportunity to express their will as citizens and individuals, and they argued that allowing women the power to vote would yield a positive influence on local and national politics. In particular, members of the Alki Suffrage Club contended that women were naturally kinder and more concerned with children and the elderly, and that women voters would have a civilizing effect on politics. They would oppose domestic violence, liquor, and emphasize cleanliness and community. But before we go, I thought I would give you all a little behind the scenes of how this exhibit was put together. This exhibit came about initially, of course, because 2020 was the centennial for women's suffrage in the US, and the Historical Society was looking for a way to celebrate that felt really authentically connected to our service area. While doing research for this exhibit, our former collections manager and registrar, Rachel, discovered that there was a lot of history related to women's suffrage on Alki, where we're located, and that history had been kind of forgotten about and very much excluded from the narrative of women's suffrage in Washington state. Because this was an untold story situation, there was a lot of work that had to be done to actually piece the story together. The research process for this exhibit means looking through old newspaper records and digging through library and museum archives. There was also a lot of work putting together genealogies and census reports to track down as much information about who was involved and what the story looked like as possible. And then we had to look at the larger picture of women's history and women's suffrage in the state so that we could put all of this newfound information into context to see how it fit together in the overall story of suffrage that was happening at the time. Creating exhibits like this takes hundreds and hundreds of hours, which then gets whittled down into a story that is short and compelling and accessible. I hope I've been able to expand a little bit on your thinking today on women's suffrage and highlight 3 women whose work in political activism shaped not just the Alki community, but our state and our nation as a whole. So thank you so much for having me today. I don't think we're going to have any questions, but I really enjoyed being here, and I hope that this was useful.
Oh yeah, and it'll be great for the future. Hello, viewers of the future.
Hello, viewers of the future.
This is going to be on our TV channel, and I thought you did a great job. Did you do those drawings? Was that your hand doing those drawings?
That wasn't me. That was actually our former curator, Tasia. So something interesting about this exhibit from my perspective was I took over this position in October of last year. So these exhibits or this exhibit specifically was already pretty much formed. And then I had to come in as the curator later and be like, okay, like what's my spin on this? What's my take on this history? So I actually ended up doing a lot of research and deep diving into what Smith's work in the Seattle Star and other newspapers looked like, which was really exciting.
Oh, cool.
But yeah, that was Tasia. She drew that all herself.
It was fun to watch that in action. It's a really nice presentation. I appreciate your work on it. And like I said, this will be on for the future. I will turn off the recording now, unless you had other things to share with
That was it.
viewers of the future. Okay, so long and thank you. And we'll talk for a moment after I turn this off.